Okay. So hopefully we're not going to have too many problems with this today. Let's make sure we got our live transcript, enable auto transcription. And we are going to continue our discussion of the brain today. Now, you do have a quiz that is going to post. Well, it already posted this morning, and it covers chapter 2. There are 50 questions. It's going to randomly select 10 for you, and you're going to get new questions every time you take it. But this is from the same pool that I draw exam questions from. So if you want to learn the best way to study for tests, take the quizzes over and over, get exposed to as many questions as you can. And for those of you who've been a little late reading chapter 2, this will force you to read it. That's why I do the quizzes. If you're one of those people that doesn't always stay on top of your reading, there's no shame in that, but this will force you to read it. So I'm good with that. It's a win-win. So that quiz will be due Monday at 5 o'clock. And then also probably within the next week or so, if you are wanting to do some extra credit, I have a research opportunity for you that we will do in class if you would like to, and you do have the ability to opt out. But I'll talk some more about that next week. All right, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about the lobes of the brain. So we have the occipital lobe at the back, which is solely for visual information. We have the temporal lobe, which is for hearing and things related to object recognition and language comprehension. We have our parietal lobes, which are critical for sensory information like touch, attention, spatial orientation. And then we have our frontal lobes, and those are critical for things like motor movements, planning, and a variety of different behaviors that we would call executive functions. So that's things like planning, paying attention, organizing things, stuff like that. And we'll talk more about each of these lobes in greater detail. So your brain has 2 different hemispheres. So you have a right side of your brain and you have a left side of your brain. And again, that whole idea that people are primarily right-brained or left-brained, I don't care how funny Bo Burnham's bit on right brain and left brain is, there's not really such a thing as a right-brained person or a left-brained person. You use both of your lobes pretty much all the time. Now, I will say that certain parts of certain functions are going to be more likely in the left hemisphere than in the right hemisphere. So a lot of language processing tends to occur in the left hemisphere. A lot of visual processing and creative processing, a lot of that tends to happen in the right. So we do have what is called lateralization. Some functions do happen in certain hemispheres of the brain. But we have these functions that are basically divided across hemispheres. The reason that they're able to communicate with each other is through the corpus callosum. So this allows the 2 hemispheres and the information from each hemisphere to be shared with each other. So the corpus callosum is a thick bundle of fibers. It's a white matter tract, which means that it's mostly axons of neurons. And that's important for communication. It is one of the biggest white matter tracts that you have in your brain. As a fun fact, Dr. Gilchrist actually has a corpus callosum that is probably smaller than yours. I am almost entirely missing the back half for congenital reasons. So it leads to some really interesting behaviors. But I was born with it, so my brain has actually learned to compensate for what was missing. But I am neurodivergent thanks to that. Oh, they got neurodivergent in there. That's nice. I always like it when there's a word that they get in the transcript. They don't understand that neuro should not be separate from other words like neurotransmitter. Okay. Oh, sorry. I'll wait. Anybody have any questions here? So I will mention that your book talks about some really interesting things that can happen if your corpus callosum is cut. Because there is some of this lateralization of function, one of the things that we find is that if the corpus callosum is cut, information can't be shared between the two hemispheres, and this leads to something called split brain syndrome. The two hemispheres basically start to act separately from each other, and you can learn more about this in your book or in the MP3 readings that I did of the book, or both. So each lobe that we're going to talk about has what is called a primary cortex. So the primary cortex is basically the first place that a particular sense actually makes contact with the cortex. So the primary cortex is the first place in the cortex that a given sense actually is processed in the cortex. That's why we call it primary. Now, there is an exception to this, and I'm glad I'm recording because this is a little bit complicated. So the primary visual cortex is the first place that in the cortex that processes visual information. The primary somatosensory cortex is the first place in the cortex that actually processes things like touch. The primary auditory cortex, it's bigger than this. A portion of it is actually hidden under this gigantic fissure. So some of it is hidden under the surface of the cortex, but the primary auditory cortex is really the first place in the cortex that deals with hearing. Here's where it's a little bit different. The primary motor cortex, which is located right here at the very back of the frontal lobe, it's actually the last place that deals with motor information in the cortex before information is sent down the spinal cord to your muscles. So for all of our other cortexes, so for primary somatosensory, primary visual, primary auditory, those are going to be the first places in the cortex that deal with that stuff. Primary motor cortex is the last place in the cortex to deal with that stuff. Like, our naming conventions are kind of weird. I think that's what I've discovered. Eating in the dining hall today. I'm so happy. I don't get to do it all that often, so when I do, it's very exciting. And I saw that there's vegan mac and cheese on the menu today. So one thing I will remind you of, because I have written your test already, and I will have the study guide for the exam out next week, I am never going to ask you where things are located. So I'm not going to show you a picture of the brain and go, hey, find all these. I'm not going to do that to you. You just need to know what the functions of objects are, and you're good to go. Okay? Cool. Does anybody need some more time here? Cool, I can wait. You let me know when you're ready. All right, okay. So one thing that's kind of interesting, I'm going to focus on the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex. Each of them actually have a map of your body on them. So the term that we use is homunculus. So that's HOMUNCULUS. Plural is homunculi. So if we look at, we're going to start by talking about the primary motor cortex. So one of the things that we know is that areas that require more complicated and precise movement have more of the primary motor cortex devoted to those movements. So one of the things that you're going to find is, for example, there's not really a lot of primary motor cortex devoted to your toes. Has anybody ever tried to wiggle their toes? Have you ever tried to wiggle one toe? How does that work out for you? I can't wiggle one of my toes without the others coming along for the ride. Your feet are not super sophisticated in terms of their movements. But if we look at things like our hands, which are involved for things like grasping, for reaching, for picking up, there's more cortex devoted to them because those movements are more sophisticated and require more information. But the greatest amount of cortex in the motor cortex is actually devoted to our face. So think about when you speak. Think about all of the jaw movements that you have to make, the tongue movements that you have to make, the lip movements that you have to make, and additionally also moving your face, because talking and communicating is speaking is one of the main ways we communicate with each other. Our movements are very, very sophisticated there, and they're going to need more motor cortex devoted to them. So notice that the hands and the face are probably where most of our most sophisticated movements are. Now let's go to the somatosensory cortex. So areas that are more sensitive have more somatosensory cortex due to them. So once again, we're going to find that our hands and our face are going to be the most sensitive. So for example, take a look and see how much of the somatosensory cortex is basically devoted to your lips. That's why kissing is so much fun, y'all, because there's just so many sensory receptors in your lips. And generally, we need our face and our hands to be sensitive to touch because we need to get feedback from our motor movements. So if I'm using a sophisticated motor movement to grab my cup, I also need sensation in my hands and my fingers to know that I've got a good grip on it, right? And when I'm speaking, I need feedback from my senses and from touch to make sure that I'm making the right movements. So again, areas that are more sensitive and have more sensory receptors have more cortex devoted to them. So occasionally somebody will ask me, well, Dr. Gilchrist, what about the genitals? Those are pretty sensitive. They're actually not as sensitive as you think. You can actually see that very little of the somatosensory cortex is actually devoted to the genitals. Likewise, very little of our sensory cortex is devoted to our lower body. So it's part of the reason why, how many of you have had this happen? You stub your toe and it takes like 5 minutes for you to even realize that you stubbed it and that it's hurting. It takes a while for you to notice. Now, on the other hand, if you get a paper cut, oh, you feel that right away. So I'll tell you a goofy story to kind of illustrate how bad your toes are at sensing things. So when I was in graduate school, I was on the phone with somebody and I was walking around downtown wearing flip-flops. And I kind of struck my foot against a metal grate where they had kind of planted a tree. And I didn't really think too much of it. It hurt, but I kept walking. And all of a sudden, my feet felt really, really wet. And like 5 minutes later, I'm like, why is all this water on my foot? Did I step in a puddle? And I look down and my big toe is just covered in blood from where I had struck my toe against that grate. And I didn't even realize that it was bleeding until much later because our toes and our feet are just not that sensitive. Now, I want to talk a little bit about one particular area that is special for us, and that is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex basically takes up about 30%, almost 1/3 of your brain. So basically, it's any part of your frontal lobe that is not for a motor process. So this is going to be critical for a variety of different things. So this is critical for modifying emotional responses, responding in socially appropriate ways, rational thought, behavior, judgment, attention, and planning. And this is what separates you from other animals. No other animal has this much prefrontal cortex in their brain. Some don't even have a prefrontal cortex at all. Anybody need some more time? Okay, I can wait. All right. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the case of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage is probably one of the best known cases of somebody with frontal lobe damage. And a lot of what we know about the frontal lobe comes from his story. So for those who don't know, Phineas Gage worked for a railroad. And so one of the things that you need to know about making room for rail lines is that they have to be pretty flat. You can't have a railway line going up a very, very large hill. The train, unless it has enough power, is not going to make it. And to put this into perspective, this was in the 1800s. The engines probably didn't have as much power as they do now. So the rail lines often had to be very flat. Now, if you've been pretty much anywhere in the United States that is not Florida or certain parts around the Gulf Coast, you know that most land is not flat. And so you're going to have to blast away areas of rock and hills to make that land flat for a rail line to come through. So, for example, Missouri can actually be pretty hilly in certain places, but if you've ever been on the MKT trail or ridden a bike on the MKT trail, it's actually pretty flat. And that's because the MKT trail used to be a rail line. So to be able to blast away rock, what you usually want to do is put in a hole. And in that hole, you're going to pack gunpowder and you're going to pack a fuse. And eventually, at some point, somebody is going to strike that fuse and that gunpowder with an iron tamping rod. That's going to create a spark against some flint, and that's going to basically cause this to burst and explode. You don't want that to happen right away. So normally what you would do once you've got the flint, the fuse, and the gunpowder is you're going to cover that up with sand until it's time to tamp. And the iron tamping rod is about 1 meter long. For those like me who do not do well with metric, that's about 3 feet. So Phineas Gage was working on this railroad, and we're not really sure exactly why this happened. I've heard it's because somebody forgot to put sand in. Sand is supposed to help control the blast a little bit, but he struck his tamping rod against gunpowder, and the fuse basically ignited. And then the explosion went off, and it basically fired the tamping rod under his eye socket, and it came out through. So you can kind of see the entry wound and the exit wound. This actually damaged both hemispheres of his frontal lobe, particularly his prefrontal cortex. So he actually didn't die. Now, let's be clear, he almost died, but not because of the damage. He was able to actually sit up, and he was able to actually walk the distance with some assistance to a doctor's office. So he was conscious throughout all of this. He almost died because of a fungal infection that happened in this wound. But so he lived, but his personality really, really changed. So obviously you can kind of see in this picture here, he's standing with the tamping rod that, well, actually did it. He's not going to be able to see in that eye anymore. Like there's no vision in that eye. But he was a pretty gentle, mild-mannered person. And then he started being lazy. He engaged in, I believe the phrase was the grossest profanity, which back in the 1800s was probably the word heck. He engaged in profanity, he engaged in drunkenness. His friends basically said he was no longer the person that they knew. So this is one of the ways that we learned that the frontal lobe is actually critical for a lot of our personality traits, behaving appropriately in different social situations, and regulating and controlling our emotions. If you're ever in the Boston area, you can actually go and see Phineas Gage's skull. I have. You're not allowed to take a picture of it. It's in the Harvard Medical Library on their Longwood campus. It's up on the top floor along with the tamping rod, but you're not allowed to take any pictures. But I got to go to Boston for a conference like 12 years ago, and we all took the day off to go see Phineas Gage's skull. It was fun. So now let's talk about the peripheral nervous system. So we talked about the central nervous system. Now we have to talk about the peripheral nervous system. And I know what you're thinking. Why should I care? Do you struggle with anxiety or stress from time to time? Raise your hand if you're not stressed at all at any time. You've never gotten stressed in your life. I don't see any hands up. How many of you have been pretty stressed? And if not today, then recently. Yeah, you should care about your peripheral nervous system then. So the peripheral system is really critical because it controls our body. So the central nervous system sends messages out to the body, and it does this through the peripheral nervous system. And it does this, it communicates with the brain and the body in two different ways. So first of all, it sends information from our senses, such as our sight, our hearing, our touch, and our taste. All of that information is sent to our brain so that we can figure out what we want to do with that information. And we also get messages from our brain to guide our body. There are two major divisions of the peripheral nervous system. The first is what we call the somatic nervous system, and then the other one is the autonomic nervous system. Bless you. Everybody good? Okay. So I'm just going back here really quick because we've already kind of talked about this a bit. So here, here are our major divisions of our nervous system. So we've talked about our brain and our spinal cord. We are now moving to the peripheral nervous system. We have our skeletal or somatic nervous system, which controls voluntary movements of your muscles. And then we have our autonomic nervous system, which controls a lot of the functions of our internal organs and our glands. We don't really have to think very much about them. And then those can be divided into our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight system, and our parasympathetic nervous system, which we sometimes refer to as the rest and digest system, because we're going to conserve our energy and relax. I have fuzz in my mask. It keeps bugging me and making my face itch. All right, everybody good? Okay, so our somatic system responds to our sensory input, so information from our sensory system. So this is going to basically transmit signals to and from our central nervous system through nerves that are basically bundles of axons. So nerves are bundles of axons that are basically branching out from the spinal cord. And this allows us to make voluntary movement based on our sensory experience. So right now, if you can, I'd like you to reach for something small. Really quick, just reach for something small. Well, I don't know if that's that small, but it's relatively small. No, you don't have to reach for anything else. It was fine. Like your Apple Pencil is pretty small. Okay, now I want you to reach for something larger that you have. Did you notice that your hand kind of changed its grip based on what you were reaching for? So if I reach for my mask, I'm going to do this. I do this little pinchy. If I reach for this, I've got a much wider grip. So your sensory system is basically keeping track of what you're seeing and how you're reaching for something to help you pick the appropriate grasp. And that's how the somatic system basically uses this sensory information to help you out. So this system is not only connected to our muscles, but it's also connected to our joints. So for those of you that like to do things like squats, it will let you know when you're squatting too low, and like Dr. G might fall over. And it's also connected to your skin, so it helps sense things like skin stretch, so you can know if an object is slipping from your grasp or not. So some of our reflexes actually are based on the somatic nervous system. So for example, how many of you have touched something hot recently? And here's what's interesting. What happens when you touch something hot is you immediately move your whole body away from that. I actually kind of got some hot water on my hand from my tea today. So I was picking up my mug and some hot water got in my hand and I put the whole thing down and just went. That's your somatic system in action. It's sensing that you just touched something painful and it's wanting you to get your body away from that as quickly as it can. Oh, don't apologize. You take your time. Worst case scenario, if I need to make a video to cover some more things like before chapter 3, I'll do it. I don't mind. I probably won't make it an hour because I don't want to push myself too hard, but don't feel bad. You shouldn't. Right. While you are waiting, watch this wonderful trick I can do. Ooh. Yeah, I know that's not really that much of a trick. I got better magic tricks coming up, I promise. Okay. So our autonomic nervous system basically helps regulate our body. And this happens automatically. So things like breathing, heart rate, blood sugar, blood pressure, all of those things are things that you generally do not have to think about. And this is because the autonomic nervous system is responsible for stimulating our glands and our internal organs, such as our heart and lungs. Now, there are two major divisions that I mentioned, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous system is designed to give our body energy to deal with stress or challenges. That can include emotional or psychological stress. It can also include physical stress. Exercise is physical stress that you put on your body. And the parasympathetic nervous system is going to help calm us down when that stressful event is over. Anybody need some more time? Okay, I saw nods, so I'll wait. While I am waiting, I will stretch. One of the unfortunate things about growing older is that you start to wake up and you have pain in places you didn't understand why. Like, I wake up and I'm like, my neck is sore. How did that happen? What did I do to make my neck hurt? Like, why are my ankles sore this morning? I didn't even do anything yesterday. It'll happen to you someday. But it does feel good to stretch. Did anybody go to yoga this week? The community yoga on Tuesday, wasn't it fun? I loved it. Joe's great. Okay. So let's talk about each of these different systems. So you don't need to write this down. So just take a minute to look, and I'm going to show you a couple of interesting things with our cursor. So first of all, what I want you to notice, so here's your spinal cord, all of it. One of the things that I hope you kind of notice is that our two nervous systems, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, are completely separate from each other in the spinal cord. So our sympathetic nervous system is largely going to be located in areas of our thoracic spine, so kind of our upper back. And our lumbar spine, which is basically kind of our lower back. And then our parasympathetic nervous system is largely going to be for in our cranial nerves at the brainstem, and also at our sacral spine at the very bottom of the spinal cord. So let's talk about some of the different things that the sympathetic nervous system is for. So when you're stressed, the body is going to try to get energy that it needs to either fight or run from what is stressing you out. So here are some different things that you can experience. So when you're stressed, your pupils will dilate. You'll also experience this if you're super sensitive to caffeine right after you have some coffee. It's going to kickstart that sympathetic nervous system, at least for me it does. Your heart rate is going to increase. Your digestion is going to be inhibited. Your liver is basically going to stimulate release of glucose. Glucose is one of your body's biggest sources of energy. The adrenal glands are going to secrete both epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's why they're sometimes called adrenaline and noradrenaline. And then your bladder is going to relax, and then ejaculation will potentially happen. For the parasympathetic nervous system, the pupil will contract or constrict. So everything that happens in the sympathetic nervous system, the opposite is going to happen in our parasympathetic system. So where the pupil dilates under stress, once you relax, it contracts. Your heart rate will slow, respiration will slow, digestion will start again. The gallbladder will be stimulated to metabolize all of that glucose that you were using. The bladder is going to contract, and blood is going to flow to the sex organs, which could mean either an erection or clitoral engorgement. And I just felt really awkward saying that, so I'm kind of a prude, so I'm moving on. But this is our fight or flight system and the actions that it does. And this is our rest and digest system. And they kind of work in opposite ways to help us deal with challenges and then recover and conserve our energy properly when the stress is over. Your body was not designed to be under constant stress. It's why a lot of people have been kind of burnt out for the past year and a half. And it's why it's really important to find good ways to manage your stress in ways that are healthy for you. So briefly, I want to talk about nature versus nurture and the role of genetics. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about intelligence in chapter 8 and the role that psychology plays in all of this. We're going to have to save the magic tricks for next time. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't get your hopes up, but they will be around on Monday. That is a promise. I apologize. I thought we didn't have this much to do, but we did. Sometimes that happens. So our genes affect us and they affect our behavior. So when we're talking about a gene, we're talking about a unit of heredity. Now, your genes are not your destiny. Just because you have a genetic predisposition to a mental illness or a certain type of physical ailment does not necessarily mean that it is going to happen. Often what we are going to find is that genes will only express themselves in certain types of environments. So for example, my postdoc advisor got really, really sick in my second year of my postdoc. He caught whooping cough, which then basically became walking pneumonia. And he was basically out for about 2 weeks. And this was back in 2012. So this was not like anything related to COVID. So he was basically out for about 2 weeks, or more than 2 weeks, in fact. I had to give his final to his students. So I came in, I'm like, I'm Dr. Gilchrist, your instructor can't be here today. Here's his cell phone number if you have any questions on the creativity final. But it turned out that he had a genetic predisposition to type 1 diabetes. He'd never had type 1 diabetes before, but this illness put so much stress on his body that after he had type 1 diabetes as a result. And once he felt well enough to come back to campus, he walked by my office and said, somebody gave me this bag of chocolate. I want you to have it for helping me out because I'm not allowed to have it anymore. But those kind of things can happen. You have this predisposition, but it may not happen until your body is under severe physical stress or psychological stress. So here's what we know. Your genetic makeup is your genotype. That is set at birth and you can't change it. No, you cannot change your genes by sitting on the microwave. That's not going to happen. I was making a joke. I don't actually believe people.
But was that actually a thing?
No, it's a Simpsons reference. It's a Simpsons reference. Can I change my DNA by sitting on the microwave? Like it's silly, but genes will only express themselves in certain types of environments. So your environment can influence whether genes are expressed or not. You could have a predisposition to something like depression, which never shows up. It's less likely to happen if you're in an environment where you're not experiencing things like bullying, teasing, abuse, family issues. But if you're in a family that fights a lot and there's teasing and you've encountered abuse and you have that predisposition for depression, it does make it more likely. Again, it's not guaranteed, it's just more or less likely. So your environment will affect whether or not these genes are expressed. So how do we learn about genetic effects? By the way, this is the point where I remind you that give or take, you share about 60% of your DNA with bananas. I'm not kidding. Okay, so how do we learn about genetics? One of the best things that we have are twin studies. We can look at similarities and differences between different types of twins. So we can look at twins that come from the same egg. So monozygotic twins, they are identical twins. What percentage of genes do they share? They share 100%. Dizygotic twins come from separate eggs and are what are known as fraternal twins. How many genes do they share? They share 50%, just like you do with your siblings. So identical twins share 100% of their genes. Fraternal twins only share 50%. But because they're twins and they're born around the same time, they do tend to share the same environment if they're raised together. So we can look at the effect of environment and we can look at the effect of genes. So we can look at twins that are raised together versus twins that are raised apart, like Parent Trap situation. So when we look at the effect of genes and environment, some people refer to this as behavior genetics, but that's a really weird way to phrase it. I call it behavioral genetics. And so people who do these kind of twin studies are looking at how genes and environment interact with each other to influence different psychological phenomena like mental illness, intelligence, development, learning, memory, all sorts of stuff. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop here because it's 10:49 and I don't want to go over. So we will finish this up next time. We really will do magic tricks on Monday. That's a promise. What I might do is have you read about sleep and dreaming on your own time, or I can film a small little section so that you can learn about that on your own time because we do need to get to chapter 3. I already wrote the test. I can't unwrite it. So folks, have a wonderful weekend. I will see you on Monday. Bye, everybody. Uh-huh.
I have the 3rd edition book. Is it gonna be okay?
Yeah, you should be okay. You should be okay.
It doesn't have much content different.
Not really.
Okay.
If you have any questions, just shoot me an email, or if you have a question on the quiz that maybe something was a little off there, just let me know. I'll take care of it. But there's this,